Welcome to this webinar of the SME Centre. Today we are going to discuss on more political and policy-related issues. In fact, we are going to focus on the two sessions. These are there are two meetings every year that take place at the same time. One is from the National People's Congress and the other one from the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. These two meetings are very important because they have implications both at the economic, political, social, environmental, and many aspects, different aspects of the Chinese country. And many businesses, both based in China and outside of China, pay a lot of attention to these developments, these meetings, because it will impact the businesses, will also show them where there are opportunities for them, and also the challenges that probably they will have to face during the next year. But before, please, let me introduce you the SME Centre. As many of you already know, the SME Centre is a European-funded project implemented by 6 partners. And the main aim of this project is to help European SMEs to do business with China, to get ready for China, either being investing in China, exporting to China, or serving Chinese partners. And for today, we have Mark Pina, Managing Director of Interel China, who is going to deliver this presentation on the two sessions. He has 17 years experience in China. He worked before for Lenovo in the global head office here in Beijing, and he has former and current clients covering corporate and institutional sectors. His clients include Alibaba, Society of Women Engineers, CSI Group, and he has also been he's a former advisor to the British Conservative Party in the UK Parliament. He speaks fluent Mandarin Chinese, and he's a regular commentator of Chinese affairs in TV here in China. And now I will pass the floor to Mark. Mark, can you explain us what is the two sessions and why it's important to keep an eye on these two sessions, two meetings?
Yes, sure. So, thank you for having me here first. I should just make a quick mention that those are some of my current and former clients, but not necessarily ones I work for all now. But with that in mind, what is the two sessions? So you'll see here that it's also known as the Liang Hui, and that's the Liang Hui is a direct translation from the Chinese. So if you hear people talk about the Liang Hui, it's the same meaning as the two sessions. And as you say, referring to the NPC and CPPCC. Well done for getting the names exactly right. It's difficult in English. Makes perfect sense in Chinese, but in English the translation is quite similar, particularly between the NPC and CPPCC. Now, of these two, the NPC, the National People's Congress, is the more important of the two, arguably, because it is China's highest sort of parliamentary or legislative body. In its full meeting, which is what is part of the two sessions, it approves major policies, laws, the budget, and budgetary issues. And why is this? This is obviously important. The CPPCC, on the other hand, it's advisory. It doesn't have any formal legal standing, like in some countries where you have two legislatures, they have a formal standing. The CPPC does not, but it is still important. And this includes, partly because it includes sectors of society from outside the Communist Party, so it's got a slightly broader representation, but it's also an important venue for discussing issues within China. So both of these are important venues, and they're very high level in China, and they give you an idea about how the government thinks it's done and how it thinks it's going as well, which makes it doubly important for companies to follow and examine. Now, the highlight of this for an observer is the government's work report. This is led by the Premier, so in this case it's Premier Li Keqiang, and this is a formal report which the Premier gives effectively to the whole nation, reviewing the government's progress. Usually in the previous year, but sometimes he goes back a bit further, so looking back at the previous 5 years or so, and then also explaining where the government's going in the following year. Mm-hmm. As well as this formal report, throughout this period, this 2-week period of the Liang Hui, the two sessions, you have many macro-level announcements from various government agencies, and many discussions in Chinese media as well. So it's a great way to follow the agenda and see what's coming up. And on top of that, you see there are lots of breakout meetings that happen in a similar way, actually, you get in some Western Party conferences.
Mm-hmm.
So if we move on, probably the first thing that people like to examine is what's happening with the economy, what's happening with taxation. So I think a key thing with this is the Premier's comment of that he said the state of play in the economy was good. Now this is a good marker because at a previous place in his 2017 work report he mentioned how difficult it was to maintain stable economic performance, and yet they succeeded, right?
But why did he say that it was difficult to maintain this performance?
Because I think it's because the economy has achieved better than expected. It's achieved very well. Previously you were talking about things like a new normal of lower growth, and I think they needed to manage expectations.
Now you mentioned something very important. Some years ago, Xi Jinping was talking about new normal. The government officials were talking about new normal. Now we don't hear about new normal. We hear about a new era. It's like something bigger, more positive than new normal. New normal had this message that it was, as you said, maybe a slower growth and maybe not so positive.
I think it's because the government has largely succeeded in its targets, and you can see that with, for example, just with things like the GDP. So GDP over the last year has gone up by 6.9% when they had a target of 6.5 to 7%. So it's right on the top ends of expectations. It's within it. It's not going too far for them. So I think they rightly think that they've achieved quite well.
But now that you mentioned this, the target of the GDP. I remember some years ago they were saying that they were going to remove this target because they wanted to pass from a quantity-led economy to more quality, and having a target was in certain way preventing to move to this quality-based, quality-oriented economy. But they still talk about that the economy this year is going to grow around 6.5%, so they still have a target.
It's quite difficult for governments not to have targets, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, it's quite difficult for any organisation not to have targets, so I don't blame them for that at all.
But every year they give a target and they always surpass the target also.
Well, I think, but really if you looked at 6.5% growth or 6.9% growth in any other major economy, that would be regarded as completely unachievable.
No, that's
right?
true.
So, I think if they want to manage expectations well, I think they've done that. I think they've done that pretty reasonably, particularly in this sort of this move.
But why do they need a 6.5% growth?
Well, I think it's commonly thought that that's the rough level where the structural changes in the economy are the reduction in employment because of the structural changes in the economy away from the sort of the big old SOEs. The reduction in employment is balanced by new economic growth and new jobs. So I think that's why economists consider the sort of 6.5% as a kind of magic number.
Okay.
And then if we look at the next little part of this, so we look at what's happening with taxes, another issue here. So now some of the key measures that you see changing. There's 3 VAT brackets are going down to 2. They've announced they'll raise thresholds for small-scale taxpayers, and they'll reduce employers' insurance contributions. And this is in pensions, medical insurance, also of housing schemes. The idea is that they want to it's a measure to reduce burdens on business. So it's a way of promoting.
This is quite in line with the supply structural reform.
Indeed.
They want to reduce the cost for businesses, so it will be in the same line.
Yes, I think that's exactly in line with that. So another key point that relates to businesses is the structure of the economy. So in particular, I'd like to look at what's happening within regard to the service sector and consumption. So over the last 5 years, as the Premier commented, the service sector has grown from 45% to 52% of the economy in 5 years. Now, this is a major change. So, I'd just like to quote one comment from him about this. He mentioned that economic growth in the past was mainly driven by investment and exports, is now also being fueled by consumption. This is a major structural transformation that for years our sights have been set on, but we're always unable to achieve. This is quite powerful language. And so I think observers should really note this change. This is a 7% shift in the size of the economy in 5 years. I think this is really substantial, and it shows that the sort of the rebalancing of the Chinese economy is really having a significant change. So, and you can see how they're mentioning it with some of his other statements. So you see how consumption is strengthening this as a role of driving growth. That they're looking at new models of consumption and how the government wants to develop this, and how. But also important to look at consumption is his statement that behaviour that infringes on consumers' rights and interests will be punished, right? Punished by law without leniency. Now, this is quite strong language and really suggests like the government means business.
Here I have two questions. What do they mean by new models of consumption? This will be my first question. Is it related to everything having to do with e-commerce, or what do they mean?
I think that's part of it. I think so, and we'll examine that in the next couple of slides coming. So yeah, I think that's one of it. When you're trying to build consumption as part of in the economy, they're changing the way consumption is. Chinese consumers go about their consumption. So yes, I think sort of looking at this from in terms of things like big data and tech, and we'll get onto that, I think will be part of this.
And after the second question is related to this last quote you have, without leniency. What do you mean? This what are they going to do? Is it all this related also to, I know, something that you're going to mention after maybe? It's with this reshuffling of the government. There will be this new ministry taking care of the supervision of the market. It has to do with this also, or that maybe they will put bigger fines if they don't protect the consumer rights, or the quality of the products are not good. What does it mean exactly?
Well, I think we'll talk about the sort of the sort of restructuring later. But I think the point here is that the Premier is illustrating the importance of consumption to the Chinese economy and the Chinese government, right? So, and if consumers are restrained by concerns about their rights or their interests, so then they won't spend so much. But I think this is also a way of giving people confidence in the law.
Because reading this or listening to this quote, I have the feeling that the Chinese government is going to put more emphasis maybe on consumer rights, also using more instruments like the anti-monopoly law to make sure that the pricing is the right one also. I have the feeling it's this, but I'm not totally sure. What's your feeling?
Yeah, I think they'll be looking at different ways of doing this.
Okay, thank you.
So one sector I'd like to look at, which I think is increasingly important, is the tech sector. And part of this is the government's Internet Plus plan. And now, really just looking through the Liang Hui and issues discussed in this, you can see the tech sector crop up everywhere, right? So just looking through this, we can see how they talk about this, how it's reshaping China's growth model. You can look at big data and Internet Plus now in areas like medical care, education, culture, sports, business startups, job creation, agriculture, government services, and a more general sort of building a digital China.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you a question on that. We see that innovation is one of the big drives in the Chinese government for economic development, and we see that in, as you said, in plans like the Internet Plus or the AI 2030 and all that. So I was wondering how this big push for innovation and for technology and startups, in incubators, accelerators, how can foreign companies and more concretely foreign SMEs and startups benefit from this?
What I would do is I would advise people to find local governments in China whose agenda matches that of your business or your own agenda. So it's quite commonly kind of presumed that China is just one big government and everything is kind of the same everywhere. It's absolutely not true. So you'll find China is actually has a very decentralized model of government, and lots of different provinces, cities, towns, they have their own policies to encourage investment and different types of investment in their own areas. So I strongly recommend that any investor look very carefully about not only what is changing in the economy, what is changing the government, and how this is looking at how this will change and how it will match your objectives as an investor, but also to find individual individual areas that really welcome your investment, because then local governments they have a lot of power to provide incentives, like for tax incentives or land, whatever, lots of different ways to actually help investors if they particularly want to encourage that area.
In fact, your comment is quite in line with one of the recommendations that the SME Centre is giving in a report we are going to publish very soon on Belt and Road. We just give the same recommendation, say, look, there are 11 provinces that they are involved in projects in Belt and Road. You have to understand what are the priorities of these provinces, which sectors they are focusing, and you will probably be able to align with local officials and get projects. Yeah. So it's quite in line with what you're saying.
So now, looking a bit further about what this means in the tech sector, there was some discussion about how to regulate big data, as we were talking about that. So now, whether some people have been saying that the government should regulate this. So you see a comment on the slides here that the data should be liberated there for everyone, whereas others have taken a bit more of urged a more delicate approach. When big data platforms are major sectors of the economy, and this is an area where some Chinese companies are leading the world on. So, and with that in mind, and also looking at regulation of sort of anti-monopoly law, the antitrust enforcement of this was developed initially for the industrial economy rather than the digital economy. So, therefore, any regulation should be looked at quite cautiously. So some people are taking this perspective as well, and I suspect that that's more likely to be the answer. When we're looking at companies involved in big data, as China is very effective at this, and some of the Chinese companies are very, very powerful here. I suspect the government will be a bit cautious about this rather than pushing into to change this.
I've been discussing with some both Chinese and European companies, and I find both sides also in the same way you just mentioned. But many of them, they mentioned that they would like that certain data was liberated because, for example, in insurance, they would like to have more information about the health of people in order to be able to design better products, establish better premiums, also related to car accidents, that they would like to understand the history of a car, or also the history of a plague for a car. Also have access to certain information when, for example, driverless cars. They need also the information for mapping and all this. And this is information that right now is secret in China, that you cannot have access, not totally open. So in certain way there's this push that protecting the people, also protecting certain secrets or certain sensitive information, and also the commercial need in order to be able to offer better products also.
I mean, I guess this is a discussion that is happening not only in China, but elsewhere in Europe.
Absolutely, it's
definitely in Europe.
It's happening very, very much in Europe. This is a major
Yes.
issue there.
Yes.
So I think this is part of. China. I think China will examine these issues and come to a form of regulation that suits China. And I think you raised some very interesting points, and I suspect they'll be examining them.
Yeah. But also another issue that related to technology and data is that for certain sectors, there's a push here in China to localize the data. Also, what's your view on this?
There are some sectors that they might look at localizing the data. You mean by localizing? Do you mean it's like citing it in China?
Yes, and making it a bit difficult also to have a cross-border exchange.
Well, I think they have some concerns about this too.
Yes.
But we'll have to see how this develops, I think.
Mm-hmm. I know that the arguments on both sides, for pro and against it, and I know that some people say, if we been able to have the data also, or be able to exchange data with other countries, we can also be able to analyze better the data and all this. But others say, but we have to be careful also which data goes out of the country.
Well, I think both sides have got some. Both you make both points that are good. They cover both sides of the argument.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's just interesting that this tech sector is particularly lively topic within the two sessions.
I think, in fact, tech sector in China in the last two years and now and probably in the near future is going to be a hot topic.
Yeah, I think so. Well, it's also an area where Chinese companies are doing very well.
Yeah, they're doing extremely well, in fact.
All right. So one issue that the Premier mentioned in particular is he talked about 3 critical battles that the government would be looking at. And these are, the first was diffusing risks. So in this, they'll be looking at stronger internal, like financial regulatory risk controls. So trying to help manage financial risks. This is something that the government's been particularly careful about. This is, if you think back to the Liang Hui from last year, one of the big themes there was like managing risk, right? We'll talk more about this later, but here this is an example of how they're continuing this approach. But I think this is an individual example of that. But I think, as I'll talk about it later, I think the tone of this year's Liang Hui is slightly different from that. But this is nonetheless continuing in particular. Also, local government debt. So the government will be continuing a crackdown on unauthorised sort of local government debt and encouraging provinces to take more responsibility for this issue, and also to look at determining sort of more standard mechanisms for local governments to secure financing, in other words, giving them more appropriate means for securing financing.
Because just recently appeared the news that state-owned banks are forbidden now to finance local governments also. So this is very important, how they are going to get the financing otherwise.
Exactly, but I think that's why they're talking about this. They're not on poverty, so poverty alleviation is the second of the 3 critical battles. Now this has been a huge topic for Xi Jinping actually for years, and the 5-year plan makes a big thing about this. And the targets that were issued in the 5-year plan on poverty alleviation were at the time regarded as quite hard, quite difficult, and that civil servants really had to work for them. But the Premier is quite pleased with the results. They've made decisive progress, lifting 68 million people out of poverty. This is a huge number, by the way. I don't want to emphasise this. You think about 68 million people is the size of a large country around the world. So to actually lift 68 million people out of poverty is quite an impressive result. So I think this is over the last 5 years, right? And this also changes the structure of the economy slightly. So you can see the urbanization of China increasing from about 53% to around 58.5%. It's also a big jump. That's in 5 years, and then further this will continue in the next year.
Yeah, I find it personally very telling when you look at the numbers, the investment that will be dedicated to reducing poverty. I think it was around 106 billion RMB. That's quite an investment, I think. So it's definitely high on the agenda.
Yeah, and I think companies should remember that because this is high on the government's agenda, they will be helping benefit China if they can help the government in its own goals to alleviate poverty. For example, in say rural areas, or sort of say in Western China.
But this is also very important for foreign companies. This point and the next one also, because probably a lot of opportunities will appear from here, will arise from these 3 critical battles.
Yes.
Also.
Yeah. Moving on to the third of the critical battles, so that's is pollution. So the government is proud that over the last 5 years the environment has seen gradual improvements. If we look at, say, air pollution, in the recent measures to control air pollution around Beijing have been very successful. Anyone who's been living here can testify how the last winter is like massively better than the previous one, and actually that the air has consistently improved a lot since last year, on average.
But here again, we have to wonder at the costs of this huge improvement in pollution. And I was wondering here, what would be the next steps for the government in terms of implementation of pollution reduction? Because we have seen that, yes, indeed, the pollution in Beijing has improved, vastly improved, but we also have seen that there have been some problems with heating in neighboring provinces. So,
well, I think that I think what we'll see is the government will take some of the lessons it's learned from this regional approach and try and expand that more broadly over the country. So, I mean, I don't think this is one. I think I would be surprised if there was such a great shift as we've seen in Beijing. That you'll get such a large shift as we've seen in Beijing over the last year in many other parts of China. But I think that there will be lessons that they can learn, and I think we can hope that slowly that the air quality will improve.
Wait, do you think that these three battles are going to determine the KPIs for government officials? Because normally they talk that government officials, they have a KPI on economic growth, and these last years also on environment measures, but will they also include something on diffusing risks and also poverty alleviation?
I think so. I mean, if the government's making specific targets, so for example in 2018 on energy consumption per unit of GDP, if there's a specific target for a drop on that, then I think they have to have targets, don't they? So I think we should expect to see some.
So this is something very important for companies also to bear in mind.
Yeah, I mean, if you can help China to improve its energy consumption, then I suspect that that you've got a good case. Yeah, it's a good place for you. It's a good place to be welcomed. Another issue is that the Premier talked about completely prohibiting garbage imports. Now, that probably means something quite specific, but China clearly has a very big issue with regards to waste and has more than enough of its own to deal with, so it's not unreasonable for them thinking that we've got to manage our own rather than to have lots of imports. I suspect we'll see that it will make it much harder for importers, but there may be different categories that might be acceptable. So I think this is a trend, but I suspect it won't be. I suspect you'll see that it's a bit more nuanced than other people might think. Now, quality. So we're talking about quality of goods. Now, this is something that's been mentioned repeatedly in previous Liang Hui's over the years. But this time I think that the government's language is stronger. It's been repeatedly getting stronger over the year. And here we're talking about things like strengthening the perception of quality of Chinese goods. So, and if you look at some of the Premier's comments here, so looking towards meeting the highest international standards and igniting a revolution in the quality of Chinese goods. This is quite powerful language again. So
here, I was wondering, we're talking about an increase on quality, but it seems also that we are talking about better marketing, improving the image of China, which is, I guess, a bit related to soft power, soft power push by the government and the party.
I think that's connected, but I also think that the reputation of Chinese goods internationally is lower than the actual quality involved. Like many Chinese companies now make extremely high quality goods. So you like the huge, big and well-respected brands. So you can look at companies like Alibaba and Lenovo, and they're right at the top of the world for what they do. So we're not talking about poor quality here. So I think that China's reputation there doesn't quite match reality. Sure, there are issues, there are issues for them to deal with on smaller scale products, and I think that's what the government's trying to look at. But they're trying to improve not only the perception, but also a kind of culture of workmanship. This is a phrase they've used in the past. So to help people kind of, I think it's a sort of sense of like a pride of a good job well done.
Okay.
And this is something that they've talked about repeatedly over the Liang Hui. But this time, the language is getting stronger. So I think we'll see more of a push towards this. And as you say, perhaps this is also about communication. But I think the Premier is not talking about communication here. I think he's talking about reality.
Yes, it's also changing the mind, because here in China, if you read, for example, Lu Xun and others, there's this that it was very typical, that Chabaduo, that something that was more or less okay was already okay. So what it's trying to do is trying to shift this mind to a good job, something well done, be proud of what you're doing.
Absolutely. And I think this is part of the government's kind of strategic plan to move China up the value chain from a low to medium end, like product-driven economy, to a medium to higher end one that's more about consumption and services. And I think this is part of that drive. So, opening up. So, something that will be of obvious interest to foreign investors is where the government is planning to open up the economy to investors, to foreign investors. And here we have sort of a list of the sectors that they've been talking about. So it's expanding access to everything ranging from, this is not everything, but substantial areas of telecoms, medical services, education. Elderly care is another big issue. China has now an aging population, and they're trying to lead with new energy like electric vehicles. Also, you see a number of financial sector areas, so bank card clearing, also things like equity restrictions in banking, securities, asset management, and insurance agent companies.
Actually, on the topic of expanding access to certain areas, I was wondering where did you see more opportunities for foreign investment? Because although we can see that some areas are already opening up, maybe in some sectors it would be perhaps a bit too late for foreign investors to enter the market.
For example, for banking, insurance, bank card cleaning, maybe it's areas that maybe it's coming too late. It will be difficult to do anything. But other areas, maybe elderly care, for example, it could be an area that there are opportunities.
Yes, I think so, and medical services. So in particular, these. I think, and education as well. I mean, China is famous for its need and emphasis on education, but I think you mentioned these. Medical service is going to be a huge area. Elderly care, like with China's got this massive population. You know, if you can help provide like support for China's aging population, I think that's an area where it's new, right? This is not a very well developed industry in China. You know, people who are here, they can testify to this. You know, China traditionally, old people have been cared for by the family. Yeah, but this is now starting to shift, and so I think this is an area where there's an area which is particularly new. I think China will need support now by announcing that this sector will be opened up to foreign investment. I think the government is recognising that. They're also looking at other areas. So, you know, I've mentioned here some tax deferrals policies, but also practices from the free trade zones and to consider free trade ports. And another issue I think that was mentioned in passing, but I've heard mentioned amongst Chinese ministers when travelling abroad, is the China International Import Expo.
Is this the expo that's going to take place in Shanghai in November?
Yes.
Because I heard that there's a lot of interest to know more about this one, this expo. I heard that this is an initiative that comes directly from the president, and that many countries, embassies and chambers of commerce from Europe are being contacted in order to participate in this. And it looks like there's a big push from China to make it a success. And also because it will be in November, and we are just beginning of April, and normally these kind of events here in China, they are not prepared with so much time. It's normally they give you less time, so it looks like they're really pushing to make it happen and be a success.
I think so. You know, literally, as I mentioned, so I've heard Chinese ministers talk about this abroad, like and being the centre point of the comments they're making at conferences. So I really think that the government, is making a big push to this, and when the government makes a really big push towards things, then things tend to happen. So I think this would be a good place for companies to consider if you're looking at China's international imports. It's a big export, big export for this. Okay, I think the commentary about this year's Liang Hui wouldn't be remotely sufficient if we didn't talk about the major restructuring of government that was announced at the Liang Hui. Now, you could talk about this for a very long time, but I think we can just go into this sort of briefly. This includes like several new ministries that are merged by others. This reduces the numbers of ministries by 8 and sort of deputy level ministries by 7. There's a list of these that you can see on our slides. There's also 8 new agencies, including what's going to be a rather powerful market regulatory administration. This one is going to be particularly important because it's going to be responsible for everything from pricing controls, business registration, quality standards, intellectual property, enforcing anti-monopoly legislation. So this is going to be a particularly important one for international companies.
I think there will be a ministry that people will have to pay attention because of everything what you mentioned. From cosmetics, pharmaceutical, medical devices, now they will have to pay attention to them because the CFDA, IQSIQ will be all under this ministry, this administration. And everything related to pricing and anti-monopoly law, it's this one now also.
Also, we see a new financial regulator, so this merges the banking regulator and the insurance regulator into one organisation. We've also seen that the governor and party secretary of the People's Bank of China has stepped down. This is Zhou Xiaochuan, who he's been in the position for a very long time, is regarded as an extremely able and authoritative figure within the banking sector for many years.
Yes, regarding the restructuring, I was thinking that it was very interesting to see that foreign companies should not only pay attention to the restructuring in terms of big ministries, but also of sub-level bodies. For instance, the Banking and Insurance Regulatory Committee is going to be very, very relevant, especially for the reducing risks part of China's strategy. And also, I think that another really important body that foreign companies will have to look at is the immigration agency that has just been set up.
Also, I have the question for you. Maybe it's not that interesting for European companies, but why are they setting a Ministry of Veteran Affairs?
I think it's because that there's a restructuring in the military to increase quality and reduce the sheer numbers of people. So therefore, you've got more people coming out of the army or the armed forces, and they want to make sure that they're looked after properly.
Okay.
I think that's right. I have to say I'm not an expert in this area, but it doesn't surprise me. I mean, it just shows they want to look after their retired armed personnel, armed forces personnel.
Okay.
I would also point also before we move off from this topic, I think one point to make here is that what does this restructuring mean as a sort of overall, right? So I think one of the reasons for this, or one of the impacts for this will be, is we should look at how this relates to the structure of the party, because this whole streamlining makes the whole government administration a little bit more in line with that of the parties. So it should make more of a rational, more of an alignment between the party's objectives and the government's.
And also another question I had, because with all this restructuring, that means that there will be personal changes. They will also have to figure out how to merge different bodies, create the new agencies also. Won't this also have an impact to the economy in the sense that probably certain decisions will be delayed or certain reforms will be delayed until they don't have in place the new agency, the new personal changes and all this?
Possibly. You would have to look at those on a case-by-case basis. I mean, sure, there's significant restructuring going on here. I think a sort of a one particularly important issue to look at is, because there's this big restructuring going on, companies that already have or are looking to build new relations with government officials or agencies, they need to reconsider their whole sort of their relationships. Sort of, in other words, you need to redo your mapping of who's in charge of what. And for big companies that are already well engaged with a lot of these agencies, this is a big task. So I would get to work on that.
And for companies thinking of coming to China, this is very important, doing a stakeholder mapping, understanding who you have to deal with also.
Exactly. And one thing that's also not, as well, we should be thinking about SMEs and not just big companies. There is a trend as well in China to decentralize approvals and regulation, right? So increasingly, companies are now dealing with regional or like provincial or city or whatever, like more local-based representatives of these ministries, and we mentioned some of these here. So it's important not to think that everything is just done by central government. So increasingly, like particularly on an SME level, you'll be looking at engaging with the local equivalents of these, the people in these ministries, and not just looking at the sort of central government.
Yes, actually, there was a new law on the promotion of SMEs that came into force at the beginning of this year. And in this law, there is a lot of emphasis on the role of local and country level government. So definitely this is something SMEs should pay attention to.
Now, one other trend I think you see throughout sort of some of the changes in this year's Liang Hui is China's expanded soft power. So people have been talking about this more recently, about how China is paying more attention to soft power. But to give you some examples about how I see this being a trend in the Liang Hui, let's look at one of the new ministries is the Ministry of is the merger of the Ministry is the new Ministry of Culture and Tourism. So this merges the Ministry of Culture and the National Tourism Administration. This illustrates the importance of expanding and linking culture and tourism to China. You see there is a brand new State International Development Cooperation Agency, which will focus on foreign aid. Now this heralds an expansion of China's development policy. So obviously this is a use of soft power. There's also a merger of the TV broadcaster, like CCTV, to radio platforms. The two China's radio platforms to merge, and this makes the what's now going to be called the Voice of China, right? So this is one organisation which will propagate China's message internationally. You've also got an increased diplomatic budget announced this year. So in other words, more money to be spent on the foreign ministry, and so this will gives them probably a bit more effectiveness abroad. You have Wang Qishan will become the new vice president, will also have a role with engaging with the US. So he's extremely powerful, extremely well linked with Xi, so I think we'll see that make an impact. And you see the former foreign minister, Wang Yi, also take the role of state councillor, which is more important, so therefore will have more clout.
Yeah, actually, I have a question on the new people in charge of the foreign affairs portfolio, because we saw previously that there was a lot of visibility, or rather emphasis, put on Yang Jiechi, which was considered the top diplomat in China and was very active in China-US affairs. He has been promoted to, so I was wondering how the triad Wang Qishan, Wang Yi, and Yang Jiechi would work.
Well,
what would the dynamics be?
Well, I think we'll have to see how that comes out, but I think it shows that China's importance on foreign policy. You've got three people regarded as very competent and effective, and very well linked are at the top of this. So one of the issues that was raised interest from Western press was were constitutional changes at the Liang Hui. Now the issue that the Western press sort of focused on was the changes in the presidential term limits, from having a limit of 2 terms and removing this limit. Now, if you look at what in effect this is just a change in one of Xi Jinping's 3 titles. So he also is the head of the Central Military Commission and General Secretary, which has neither of those have term limits. So removing the term limit for the president is just one of those, and I suspect that, or people suspect that, this is just a bit more of a change of reality rather than any major significant change. But it certainly illustrates that Xi's grip on power. This sounds like it's not going to go anywhere. So is this a really substantial change? I think it's more of a demonstration of intent, of reality than any real major change.
Yeah, I think that also, as you mentioned, this doesn't really change anything because the other two positions, they didn't have a term limit.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be also sending a message that, okay, I'm in charge, now we are going to implement effectively the reforms and the promises we have done.
Yeah,
also.
I think that's right. I think it's showing that the government's not going to change its agenda rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
So in the past, you could argue that every couple of terms that there was a shift, there was a major shift in people,
Mm-hmm.
so that actually it made it harder to drive through like a longer term agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of the rationale for this. I mean, this is certainly what people will hope, and so you'll have things like the anti-corruption campaign
Mm-hmm.
will continue, and other highlights from Xi's terms.
Yeah, and also mentioning, you mentioned the anti-corruption campaign.
Mm-hmm.
One of the constitutional changes is also this new body, new agency, the National Supervision Commission. So what's your take on this?
Well, if I understand, it's going to have some new powers to investigate corruption issues, using some of the powers that previously were available within the civil service, but using powers that were previously only available to party members.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be an expansion of these powers. In other words, also a signature. It's also a signal that the anti-corruption campaign will continue.
Mm-hmm. And also it's a signal, as what we're saying, I think, that now there has to be implementation on what has been promised and what has been mentioned before, like initiatives like the One Belt, One Road, the supply side structural reform, and everything related to reform also. So now not only party members, but also officials, government officials, or people working in state-owned companies are also liable for implementing all these reforms and promises.
Yes, and as part of the constitutional changes, we have, so the Xi Jinping thought is now formally in the constitution, as is One Belt, One Road. So it should be said the Belt and Road Initiative, right? This is the proper name for it. So this means that these items are now formally enshrined within the party's constitution, and therefore it also adds power to their implementation.
Yes, I agree. Also, another thing that was enshrined in the Constitution is the essential role of the party in the development of China, and I think that goes to show the commitment of Xi Jinping to strengthening the party, not only in practice, as we have seen in the more practical side of the results of Liang Hui, but also in enshrining it in the Constitution.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we'll see the government's agenda being consistent and being driven through.
And also something that has been part of the constitutional change is that there's a bigger focus this time on international relations. You already mentioned it with all these changes in the government, but also they added language on opening up to the world, on having a harmonious, beautiful world, things like this.
Well, why don't we move on?
Yes.
Because I think sort of looking at the sort of the tone of the Liang Hui will partly answer that. So I think if you compare 2018 to previous years, I think you can see a sort of more confident, upbeat language being used throughout the Liang Hui. And we're not just talking about the Premier's comments, but also those from the President and others. So, for example, there's less mentions of things like the government saying we'll prioritise this or place emphasis on that. This is a more positive thing. Previously, you can see this, for example, in economics, how the government's quite proud of its achievements, and certainly if you contrast that with how they're talking about in the previous year, the language is stronger. And in foreign policy, you can see, for example, there's some of the language talks about sort of justifying success by how China is now better viewed by the world, right? So this is also quite confident, because you've been achieving this, and this is actually one of the government's big policies, is to open up China into a more put its head above the parapet on international issues. But this also means that China wants to build its international reputation and will justify its success partly by doing this. But this does raise the bar of expectations, right? So you do care about how people think about you.
In fact, I think they should take care, especially what's happening right now with the potential trade war also.
Yes, but many of these issues are are global issues. So things like the environment. Or globalization. These are things that the government has rather boldly taken a sort of a powerful stance on this over the last year. So I think this also shows that the government is changing its approach. But this is an example of it. So it's a different tone. It's a more international tone as well. And this is quite different from like a new normal. So new normal then, as we were talking about earlier, was trying to show how that. To manage expectations of slightly lower economic growth, but better quality, but lower volume. Now we're moving to more sort of stronger language about how they've achieved more. They're seen, they're regarded as more of a success in the eyes of the world. And as we've discussed before, Xi is undoubtedly in charge, and will continue to do so.
Thank you very much. Before concluding, I would ask you, could you give maybe just a few words on what summarizing your presentation, just a few words on what should the European SMEs pay the most attention of the outcomes of the Liang Hui, and whether there are opportunities for them.
Well, I would look through in your area of business to see where the government's priority is to match them. And we've seen some examples of areas where the government is looking to open up. That's new. But there are others, pollution, environment, poverty, higher end technology. You can, if you look, to be honest, I think you should really look through this in more detail and have examine what this and the whole, what the political environment, political regulatory environment means for your business. But we've listed some examples here. But I think investors or people thinking about investing into China should look to do a sort of regulatory analysis as well as just simply legal due diligence.
And I imagine also that with the Boao forum coming up soon, we should pay attention what the presidency is going to say there.
Because you should, and you should also look at because this will tell you what the government's agenda, how it's going to change. So it's like longer term changes in the economy. Basically, they're saying what they're planning to do. We should examine this in a similar way that people do examine political events in the West. Right? They tell you what the government's been quite open about what it's doing in many areas. It's well worth studying because it's going to matter to your business.
Thank you very much, Mark. As Mark has mentioned, you have to keep an eye on the policy developments here in China. Sometimes access to information is difficult. We know that in China you can get the information, and it's probably the language is a barrier for USMEs based in Europe. But here you have the European SME Centre that can help you with your questions. If you have any question about the market here in China, policy development, we can help you and also identify potential opportunities. In any case, I also wanted to mention that I wanted to thank Mark, but if you have any question for Mark, please send it to us, the USME Centre's website. You will find our contact details. You can send us an email, and we pass your questions to Mark. Okay? Okay. Thank you very much, Mark, and also thank you, Esther.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.